The drone feed flickered once, then locked. On the screen, a column of Russian BMP-2 infantry fighting vehicles was moving through the same gap in the tree line it had used 3 days before. The Ukrainian operator steadied his breath. He had seen this approach before. Everyone on the southwestern axis had seen it before. That was exactly the problem for Russia. Within the next 4 minutes, 7 of those vehicles would be burning, and the men inside them would never understand why their commanders sent them down the same road again. Over the next 34 minutes, we are going to reconstruct how a single stretch of open farmland southwest of Vuhledar became the most consistent armor graveyard of the entire war. We will show you the terrain, the weapons, the layered ambush net, and the decision-making failures that fed Russian mechanized columns into a kill zone so predictable that Ukrainian spotters could set up their firing solutions before the engines started. According to Oryx open-source data, Ukraine destroyed or disabled at minimum 29 confirmed BMP-2 infantry fighting vehicles on this axis. The real number is likely higher, and almost every single one of them died in the same fields, on the same approaches, in the same way. How does a modern military repeat the same catastrophic mistake that many times? And what does the answer reveal about the deeper failures of Russian doctrine? Start with the ground itself, because in this story, terrain is destiny. Vuhledar sits on a natural promontory in the southern Donetsk region, roughly 40 kilometers west of Donetsk city. The town is an unremarkable mid-sized mining settlement built around the coal industry of the Donbass. But its elevation is not unremarkable. Vuhledar rises approximately 60 to 80 meters above the surrounding steppe, and the approaches from the south and southwest cross open agricultural land with almost no natural cover. No forests, no ridgelines, no folds in the earth deep enough to hide a vehicle column, just flat or gently rolling fields, broken by tree lines at irregular intervals, and the old road network built for farm traffic, not armored assault. To the west and northwest of the town, the terrain features something that became critical to the Ukrainian defense: mine spoil heaps, the elevated waste tips left behind by decades of coal extraction. These artificial hills, some reaching 40 or 50 meters above the surrounding fields, gave Ukrainian forward observers a commanding view across every vehicle approach route for kilometers in every direction. A BMP-2 column moving toward Vuhledar from the south could be observed from the moment it cleared the last tree line, tracked across open ground, handed off between observer teams, and engaged at a range of choice. The spoil heaps were not fortifications. They required no engineering. They were simply there, products of industrial history, and they handed Ukraine a surveillance advantage that no amount of Russian electronic warfare could fully neutralize. Russia's forces in this sector in late 2022 and into 2023 consisted primarily of elements from the 155th Naval Infantry Brigade, a unit badly mauled in earlier fighting around Pavlivka just weeks before and reconstituted at partial strength, along with supporting elements from other formations of the 14th Army Corps. The 155th had a reputation, not a good one. In the fighting at Pavlivka in October and November 2022, the brigade had suffered catastrophic losses in failed frontal assaults, and its commanders had reportedly sent written complaints up the chain of command about the senselessness of the orders they were receiving. Those complaints were documented in intercepted Russian communications and later reported by Russian independent media before such reporting became impossible. The unit that arrived at the Vuhledar axis was not at peak strength, not at peak morale, and not operating under a command structure that had demonstrated any flexibility. On the Ukrainian side, the defense of Vuhledar was anchored by the 72nd Mechanized Brigade, a regular Ukrainian army formation with significant combat experience and, critically, a command culture that had adapted aggressively to the realities of drone-integrated warfare. The 72nd had spent months refining a signature approach: layered fires, observer-directed, with anti-tank guided missiles at long range, FPV drones closing the kill zone at medium range, and pre-zeroed mortar fires targeting the retreat lanes through which damaged vehicles and their crews would attempt to withdraw. It was not a single weapon that destroyed 29 BMP-2s on this axis. It was a system, a deliberate, rehearsed, terrain-informed system. Russia had vehicles. Ukraine had geometry. Here is where the tactical comparison crystallizes the problem. The BMP-2 is a Soviet-era infantry fighting vehicle first fielded in the 1980s. It carries a 30-millimeter autocannon, a Conquer's anti-tank missile launcher, and a crew of 3 plus up to 7 dismounted infantry. Its armor protection is thin by modern standards, designed to defeat small arms and shell fragments, not dedicated anti-tank systems. On open ground against a prepared defender with modern anti-tank guided missiles, the BMP-2 is fundamentally vulnerable. Ukraine's Stugna-P anti-tank guided missile system, by contrast, is a domestically produced weapon with a maximum effective range of approximately 5 kilometers, laser beam guidance, and a tandem warhead capable of defeating composite and reactive armor on main battle tanks. Against a BMP-2, it is not a close contest. A Stugna-P team operating from a concealed position on or near one of the spoil heaps could engage a vehicle column at ranges where the column could not effectively return fire. The geometry was not a surprise. It was the whole point. The intercept record from this period, fragments of Russian unit communications that became available through Ukrainian intelligence releases and monitoring by open-source groups tracking radio traffic, paints a picture of repeated tactical surprise that should not have been surprising at all. A vehicle commander reporting that his column was under fire from a direction he had not expected. A unit officer relaying that vehicles had broken down in the open and could not be recovered under fire. A request for air cover that went unanswered. These are not the communications of men who were briefed on what waited for them. They are the communications of men sent forward without adequate preparation into terrain that had already claimed their predecessors because the orders required the ground to be taken and the orders did not change. The first major documented attrition event on this axis occurred in late January 2023, when a column of BMP-2s from elements of the 155th Naval Infantry Brigade attempted a direct approach from the south-southeast, moving along the road that cuts through the open fields toward the town's southern edge. Ukrainian forward observers on the spoil heaps tracked the column from several kilometers out. Stugna-P teams were already in prepared firing positions. The column had moved perhaps 2 kilometers into the open ground when the first missiles struck. Geolocated video footage, later verified by multiple open-source analysts, including members of groups contributing to the Oryx database, showed vehicles burning at intervals along the approach route. The spacing of the wrecks indicated the column had not stopped after the first impacts. It had continued forward, vehicle commanders apparently either unaware of what was happening ahead of them or unable to halt without authorization. By the time the column broke and attempted to withdraw, FPV drone operators had already repositioned to cover the retreat lanes. Worth pausing on a question. How many BMP-2s does it take before a commander revises his approach? 1, 5, 7? Because the answer at Vuhledar, documented in the wreckage, was more than 29. The FPV drone component deserves particular attention because it represents the maturation of a capability that did not meaningfully exist at the start of the full-scale invasion in February 2022. FPV, standing for first-person view, refers to small racing-style quadcopter drones flown by a pilot wearing a headset that provides a live video feed from the drone's camera. Modified for combat use, these drones carry improvised explosive charges, often repurposed RPG warheads or shaped anti-tank warheads stripped from other munitions, and are flown directly into their targets by the operator. They are not precision-guided in the Western sense. They are guided by a human being watching a screen, which makes them both extremely flexible and dependent on line-of-sight communication. At Vuhledar, Ukrainian FPV teams operated in coordination with the Stugna-P teams, filling the gap between the long-range anti-tank engagement and the final withdrawal phase. A BMP-2 that survived the initial Stugna strikes and attempted to reverse out of the kill zone would encounter FPV operators who had pre-positioned with exactly that scenario in mind. What strikes us about this combination is that it was not the result of a single tactical innovation. It was the product of institutional learning at the brigade level, where after-action reviews, shared video footage, and communications with other Ukrainian units defending similar terrain had been synthesized into a coherent ambush doctrine. The 72nd Brigade did not invent FPV drones or Stugna-P missiles. What it did was integrate them into a deliberate system calibrated to the specific geometry of the Vuhledar approaches. That is a fundamentally different level of operational intelligence than anything the Russian formations on the opposite side were demonstrating. If you have spent any time studying how military institutions absorb lessons from ongoing combat, this gap is not surprising, but it is remarkable in its scale. Put yourself in the position of a 155th Brigade company commander receiving orders to execute another column assault down the southern approach road in February 2023, 2 weeks after the vehicles from the previous attempt were still burning on that same road. What do? You carry out the order because the alternative is a court-martial or worse. But you do it knowing what you are sending your men into. The intercepted communications suggest that at least some Russian officers understood exactly what was happening. Their protests and doubts made it into the radio traffic. They changed nothing. We spent time going through the available geolocated footage from this axis, and one detail kept pulling attention back. The firing positions of the Ukrainian Stugna-P teams were not random. They were clustered on and around the spoil heaps to the northwest and west of the town, in positions with clear lines of sight across all 3 primary vehicle approach corridors. Those positions had almost certainly been selected, prepared, and ranged before the first Russian assault. The Ukrainians were not reacting to Russian movement. They were waiting for it, in positions built for exactly this scenario. The assault columns were driving into a prepared ambush, not an improvised one, every single time. The BMP-2's specific vulnerabilities are worth understanding in technical terms. The vehicle's main armor is aluminum alloy, light enough to be air transportable, not thick enough to reliably defeat a tandem warhead. The Stugna-P's tandem warhead is designed specifically to defeat explosive reactive armor bricks before penetrating the base armor underneath. Against a BMP-2, which carries no ERA packages, the Stugna-P is essentially operating against an unprotected target at any realistic engagement range. Penetrating hits from above or from the side are catastrophically effective because the interior of the vehicle contains the crew, the dismounted infantry section, and the fuel. Footage from multiple strikes on this axis shows near-instant catastrophic fires following penetrating hits, the kind of fires that leave no time for crew or passengers to evacuate. The BMP-2 was not designed to survive this engagement profile. Sending it across open ground against a prepared defender with modern ATGMs is not a tactical problem. It is an equipment procurement and doctrine problem that predates this war by decades. If you are following this war seriously, this is where the deeper pattern becomes visible. The losses at Vuhledar were not an anomaly. They were a data point in a trend running through the entire conflict. Russian commanders repeatedly committing vehicles to terrain and conditions where those vehicles had already been destroyed, apparently unable or unwilling to modify tactical approach based on observable results. The reasons for this are structural. Russian ground forces in this theater operated under what analysts at the Institute for the Study of War and other open-source analysis organizations have described as a highly centralized command structure, where initiative at the company and battalion level is constrained by orders from higher headquarters. A company commander who halted his advance without authorization risked punishment. A battalion commander who reported his assault had failed and recommended a different approach was challenging orders that had come down from a level of the chain of command that was not watching what he was watching. The gap between what the men on the ground knew and what the orders required them to do was not a communications failure. It was a feature of the command system, and that system fed vehicles into the same kill zone repeatedly because the orders said to take the ground, and the orders did not change when the vehicles burned. Here is the take that will get us some pushback, but we will say it directly. The losses at Vuhledar were not primarily a failure of the Russian soldiers who carried out the assaults. The men in those BMP-2s were not incompetent. Many of them were naval infantry, which in the Soviet and Russian tradition represents a relatively elite formation. What they were was institutionally trapped, sent forward by a command structure that valued compliance over adaptability, and that treated mounting vehicle losses as a logistics problem rather than as evidence that the tactical approach was fundamentally wrong. The real failure was at the operational and strategic level, where the order to take Vuhledar remained in force long after it should have been apparent that the cost of taking it this way would be catastrophic. The mortar component of the Ukrainian defensive system deserves separate attention, because it represents a level of pre-planning that does not always get discussed in analyses of the Vuhledar losses. Ukrainian mortar teams in this sector pre-zeroed their firing solutions on the retreat lanes, the routes that damaged or retreating vehicles would logically use to fall back from the kill zone. This requires careful observation of the terrain and real advance planning. You do not pre-zero mortar fires on retreat lanes unless you are confident enough in your prediction of enemy movement to invest the time and ammunition in preparation. The Ukrainians were that confident because the terrain left the Russian columns very few options. The approach routes funneled onto predictable ground. The retreat routes funneled through predictable gaps. Ukrainian mortar teams sat on those gaps waiting. Satellite imagery from the period, referenced in reporting by open-source analysts, showed the distribution of vehicle wrecks across the Vuhledar approaches in a pattern consistent with this multi-layer description. Clusters of burns at the outer engagement range of the Stugna-P teams. Additional wrecks further back, consistent with FPV drone strikes on withdrawing vehicles. And then isolated wrecks in the retreat corridors, consistent with mortar fire on vehicles that had managed to leave the initial kill zone only to enter the secondary one. The geometry of the wreckage told the story of the system. A question worth holding in mind as we examine the aftermath. Could a different Russian tactical approach have changed this outcome? The flat terrain and the spoil-heap observation posts presented real constraints. But a slower, more deliberate advance using infantry ahead of vehicles, with proper smoke deployment, with suppressing fire on the observed positions, with night movement, there were alternatives. None of them were used consistently. The most straightforward explanation is that timeline pressure from higher command, combined with the centralized command culture, prevented battalion and company commanders from taking the time that a more methodical approach would have required. What do you think? Was this a failure of tactical judgment by the men on the ground, or was it a failure of the system above them that gave them no real choice? That question goes to the heart of what the Vuhledar losses reveal about the Russian military as an institution. The scale of confirmed losses on this axis, cross-referenced against Oryx data and geolocated footage, amounts to at minimum 29 BMP-2s, with additional losses of BMP-3s, MTLBs, and supporting vehicles that push the overall armored vehicle toll on this specific axis significantly higher. The replacement cost of a BMP-2 from Russian defense industry, accounting for the disruption to production caused by sanctions and the high operational tempo of the broader war, has been estimated by analysts at several $100,000 per vehicle. Across the verified loss count, that represents conservatively somewhere between $15 and $20 million in armored vehicle losses on a single axis for no territorial gain. Vuhledar remained in Ukrainian hands. The human cost is harder to quantify precisely from open sources. The standard crew of a BMP-2 is 3: commander, driver, and gunner. Each vehicle additionally carried an infantry section of up to 7 soldiers. Even at reduced manning, the vehicle losses at Vuhledar represented potentially hundreds of casualties concentrated in a relatively small geographic area over a relatively short operational period. Intercepted Russian communications from the period include fragments consistent with significant personnel losses, requests for medical evacuation, reports of crew members missing, discussions of units that had lost a substantial fraction of their vehicle strength and were no longer combat effective without reinforcement. If you have been following the war since the full-scale invasion began in February 2022, the Vuhledar pattern will feel familiar, because it is the same pattern that appeared at Avdiivka's industrial zone, at the outskirts of Bakhmut during specific phases of that battle, and at multiple points along the Zaporizhzhia axis. Russian formations receiving orders to take specific objectives, attempting direct assaults with mechanized forces across terrain that favored the defender, sustaining heavy losses, sustaining them again, and sustaining them a third time because the orders required the objective and the orders did not change. This is not a tactical problem isolated to Vuhledar. It is a doctrinal problem visible across the entire theater. The contrast with Ukrainian operational learning during the same period is stark. Ukrainian brigades defending along this axis were not operating the same way in February 2023 as they had been in March 2022. They had integrated drones at every level of the tactical fight. They had refined the coordination between ATGM teams, FPV operators, and indirect fire assets. They had developed command and control practices that allowed junior officers to make decisions within a commander's intent framework without waiting for authorization from above. The 72nd Brigade's performance at Vuhledar is a case study in what decentralized, adaptive military learning looks like when it is working. The Russian formations opposite them are a case study in what centralized, rigid command looks like when it breaks down under the pressure of real combat feedback. There is a detail in the accounts of this battle that stays with you once you encounter it. Ukrainian observers on the spoil heaps, using optics and drone feeds, reported that they could see Russian columns forming up in staging areas before the assaults began. They could watch the vehicles move into approach formation. They could, in some cases, observe the crews dismounting and remounting, the preparations for movement, the signals that an assault was imminent. The Ukrainian defenders were not reacting to Russian movement in real time. They were waiting for it. The spoil heaps gave them a view that extended far enough back into Russian staging areas to provide meaningful warning. Every assault on this axis was observed from its inception. There was no surprise. There was only the question of how many vehicles would enter the kill zone before the column broke. Comment on this if you have followed the Vuhledar battles closely. Were you watching this axis in early 2023, and what did you think was going to stop the pattern? We read every comment, and this particular question has generated some of the most interesting discussions about Russian command culture we have seen. The historical parallel that keeps surfacing in discussions of Vuhledar is doctrinal inflexibility in the face of tactical feedback, a failure pattern visible in several major conflicts of the 20th century. During the early phases of the Korean War, Chinese People's Volunteer Army formations attacking across open ground toward well-prepared American defensive positions suffered enormous losses in a pattern that eventually forced significant tactical adaptation. During Operation Market Garden in 1944, the Allied command structure's commitment to a specific operational timeline led to the continuation of operations against mounting evidence that the ground situation had diverged critically from the plan. The specific dynamics are different in each case, but the underlying pattern, institutional commitment to an operation overriding the tactical feedback that should have caused reassessment, is recognizable across all of them. The wreckage field southwest of Vuhledar suggest it recurs with depressing consistency. The Stugna-P deserves a moment of detailed attention, because it has become one of the defining weapons of this war, and its performance at Vuhledar is a significant part of that story. Ukraine began domestic production of the Stugna-P in 2011 at the Luch Design Bureau in Kyiv. The system uses laser beam riding guidance. The operator keeps a laser designator on the target while the missile rides the beam to impact, which makes it difficult to jam using standard infrared countermeasures. The maximum range of approximately 5 kilometers puts Stugna-P teams well outside the effective engagement range of the BMP-2s 30mm autocannon at just over 2 kilometers. Ukrainian teams operating Stugna-P in the Vuhledar sector were engaging from ranges where the target could not effectively return fire, from concealed positions with excellent lines of sight against vehicles moving at predictable speeds across open ground. The technical parameters of the engagement were about as favorable as ATGM employment gets, and the footage from those engagements, multiple clips geolocated to the Vuhledar approaches by open-source analysts, shows the precision of the system in these conditions. Single missiles, single vehicles, single kills.
Out of nowhere.
The most surprising part of the Vuhledar story, when you examine it closely, is not that the Russian losses were so high. Given the terrain, the weapons, the command structure, and the operational pressure, losses on this scale were a predictable outcome. The most surprising part is that the assault pattern was not significantly modified for the better part of 2 months. The columns kept coming. The routes barely changed. The Ukrainians refined their positions between attacks, brought in additional FPV drone stocks, and waited. And the columns kept coming. Here is a detail from the documented record that illustrates the communication gap within the Russian system. Following one of the larger column losses on the southern approach route, a Russian radio intercept captured a battalion-level officer reporting to a higher command post. He described the situation in terms that made the scale of losses clear, requested permission to consolidate and request reinforcement before continuing, and was instructed to continue the advance with available forces. He acknowledged the order. The vehicles that moved forward after that exchange were the next entries in the Oryx database. To say this plainly, the system that destroyed those vehicles was not only Ukrainian, it was also Russian. The command structure that kept feeding BMP-2 columns into a documented kill zone, that received reports of catastrophic losses and issued orders to continue, that valued the fulfillment of an objective on a map over the lives of the men and the vehicles being committed to reach it. That structure was as responsible for the wreckage field southwest of Vuhledar as any Stugna-P team or FPV operator. By March 2023, Oryx confirmed losses on the Vuhledar axis had reached a level that forced even Russian state media, which had been running coverage of progress toward the town, to essentially stop mentioning the Vuhledar sector. The operational pause that followed was not announced. It simply became visible in the absence of new assault footage, in the decline of intercepted communications related to offensive operations in that sector, and in satellite imagery showing Russian vehicles dispersed into hides rather than assembled in approach formations. The assault on Vuhledar from the southwest had effectively stopped. The town had not fallen. It would remain in Ukrainian hands until a much later period of the war, when the overall front situation changed dramatically. The impact of the Vuhledar losses on Russian operational capability was significant. The 155th Naval Infantry Brigade had entered the Vuhledar assault already under strength from its losses at Pavlivka. What it lost at Vuhledar further degraded its combat effectiveness. Reconstituting a mechanized brigade, replacing vehicles, training new crews, rebuilding unit cohesion takes months under the best of conditions. Russia in 2023 was not operating under the best of conditions. Sanctions had constrained the supply of microelectronics needed for precision systems. Production of the BMP-2's primary optics and fire control systems required components that were increasingly difficult to source. The losses at Vuhledar were not just numbers in a database. They represented a degradation of Russian mechanized capability in the southern Donetsk sector that had operational consequences for subsequent phases of the campaign. The broader lesson for military analysts watching this conflict concerns the interaction between terrain, weapons technology, and command culture. Terrain created the conditions at Vuhledar. Weapons technology, specifically the maturation of Ukrainian ATGM capability and the emergence of FPV drones as a serious anti-armor system, determined the lethality of those conditions. But command culture determined whether the losses would be limited or catastrophic. A military institution capable of absorbing tactical feedback and modifying its approach would have sustained losses on this axis, recognized the pattern, and shifted its operational approach within days. The Russian command structure sustained those losses for weeks, possibly months, without fundamental modification. That is not a weapons problem. That is an institutional problem. What this reveals about the BMP-2 specifically is worth stating clearly. The vehicle is not a bad design for the era in which it was designed. In the mid-1980s, a vehicle that could transport an infantry section across a contested battlefield, provide fire support with a 30mm autocannon, and launch anti-tank missiles represented a genuine combined arms capability. The problem is that the BMP-2 was designed for a specific operational environment, a high-intensity conventional war on the European plain against opponents with comparable technology, and the conditions at Vuhledar bore almost no resemblance to that scenario. Against a defender with modern ATGMs, drone coverage, and command of the heights, a light aluminum-armored vehicle carrying infantry across open ground is not a tactical asset. It is a target, and the problem is not fixable by adding more BMP-2s. It requires either a fundamental change in how mechanized forces are employed or a generational change in the vehicles themselves. If you have watched the arc of this war, you already know that Russia did not make the doctrinal changes in time to matter at Vuhledar. And you probably already know that the vulnerability of Soviet-era IFVs to modern anti-tank systems, a vulnerability visible in every conflict where these vehicles have been used against a prepared modern defender, from the Chechen wars to Syria to this war, was not a secret. Military analysts had been writing about it for 30 years. The lesson was available. It simply was not absorbed by the institution that needed to absorb it. 3 questions to close with, because they do not have clean answers, and they deserve continued thought. First, could Russia have taken Vuhledar if it had approached the assault differently? With slower, more methodical infantry forward tactics, proper smoke deployment, night movement, and suppression of the spoil-heap observation posts, was a different outcome possible? The terrain was genuinely challenging, but it was not impassable. The question of whether a different tactical approach could have succeeded says something important about the degree to which the outcome was determined by doctrine versus geography. Second, what does the Vuhledar pattern mean for how NATO analysts should think about the vulnerability of legacy Soviet-era vehicles to drone-integrated defenses? The Ukrainian system that destroyed 29-plus BMP-2s was not a multi-billion-dollar procurement program. It was a combination of a domestically produced ATGM, commercial quadcopter frames modified with improvised warheads, and pre-planned fires on terrain that had been carefully studied. Any future conflict in which one side has achieved a similar combination of observation, ATGM reach, and FPV saturation over terrain that constrains vehicle movement will produce similar results, regardless of whether the vehicles on the receiving end are BMP-2s or something newer. The lesson is not specific to this vehicle. It is about the combination of conditions. Third, looking at the Vuhledar axis in 2023 and the overall trajectory of Russian mechanized operations in this war, what evidence would tell you that the Russian military had genuinely absorbed the lessons of this period? Not tactical adaptations in the field, which Ukrainian reporting suggests have been ongoing and real, but institutional adaptation, the kind of change that modifies doctrine, training, command culture, and procurement in response to combat experience. That is the harder question, and the answer will shape how this war evolves and how Russian military power is assessed in the years that follow. If you are following this war with the seriousness it deserves, subscribe to Frontline Truth UA. Every week we go deeper into the OSINT record, the equipment losses, the command failures, and the tactical innovations shaping the outcome of the most consequential land war in Europe since 1945. The next investigation is already in progress. You will not want to miss it.